Be here. John's gut told him something wasn't right, but he was raised to be the kind of man who didn't leave someone stranded, especially not on an empty road with a storm coming in. He put the truck in park and stepped out, the wind immediately whipping against his jacket as he approached her car. "Let me take a look," he offered. The woman hesitated before stepping aside. John popped the hood and peered inside, expecting to see something obvious, maybe a loose battery connection, a busted hose. But everything looked normal. He checked the wires, jiggled a few connections, and then walked back to the driver's side. "Try starting it now," he said. She climbed in and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. It was as if the car had completely lost power. John frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That's strange," he muttered. "It's not your battery, and everything looks fine under the hood. Could be your alternator, but that wouldn't just kill the car like this." The woman stepped out again, gripping her arms as if she were cold, though the air wasn't that chilly yet. "I don't have time for this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. John studied her carefully. There was fear in her eyes, real fear. He'd seen that look before, in men who'd gotten lost in the woods, in folks who'd been caught in bad storms, in people who knew they were in trouble but didn't want to say why. "You need a ride into town?" he asked, watching her reaction closely. She hesitated for just a second too long before nodding quickly. "Yes. Please." John nodded. "All right. You got anything you need from your car?" She glanced at the back seat, hesitated, then reached inside and grabbed a small, black duffel bag. The way she held it close, clutching it to her chest, told John there was something important inside. They climbed into his truck, and as soon as she shut the door, she turned and looked down the road behind them. John followed her gaze. The road stretched empty behind them, nothing but trees and the fading daylight. Yet, she was acting as if she expected something, or someone, to appear. "Someone after you?" John asked, keeping his voice calm. She turned to him sharply. "No," she said too quickly. I just need to get out of here." John considered her answer, then nodded. He started the truck, pulling back onto the road. The wipers scraped against the windshield as the first drops of rain began to fall. The silence between them was heavy, the kind that made the air feel thick. "You from around here?" he asked, trying to make conversation. She shook her head. "Just passing through." John let the words sit for a moment. The way she said them made it sound like a lie. A few minutes later, he noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. At first, it didn't seem like much, just another vehicle heading in the same direction. But then he noticed the way the car stayed back, never getting too close, never passing. It was as if they were being followed. John didn't say anything right away, but he saw how Sarah, he had finally learned her name after some coaxing, kept glancing in the side mirror, gripping her bag tighter. "Friend of yours?" John finally asked, nodding toward the car behind them. Sarah swallowed hard. "No," that was all she said, but the way her voice wavered made John's stomach tighten. The car behind them suddenly sped up, closing the distance between them just a little too quickly. John's hands gripped the wheel. He'd been in plenty of bad situations in his life, ranch disputes, wild animal encounters, even an old-fashioned bar fight back in his younger years, but there was something different about this. Something dangerous. Sarah turned to him, her face pale. "Can you drive faster?" John didn't answer. He just pressed his foot down on the gas. The truck roared forward, kicking up dust as they sped down the narrow road. The car behind them did the same, matching their speed. John's heart pounded. He wasn't sure what he had just gotten himself into, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let whoever was in that car get their hands on Sarah. Then, out of nowhere, the car behind them flashed its high beams, momentarily blinding John. He swore under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter. "Hold on," he said. Without warning, he yanked the truck onto a side road, barely visible in the dim light. Gravel flew as the tires skidded, and for a brief second, he thought they might lose control. But the truck held steady, and as they disappeared into the trees, the headlights behind them vanished. John didn't slow down until they were several miles down the road, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned to Sarah, who was gripping the dashboard, breathing hard. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, she unzipped the duffel bag and pulled something out. John's breath caught in his throat. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. It looked old, ancient, even. But the real shock was what was inside. Rows and rows of names, numbers, and symbols John didn't recognize. And at the very bottom, a name he did recognize. A name that shouldn't have been there. His own. John looked up at Sarah, his pulse hammering. "What the hell have you gotten me into?" Sarah swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were never supposed to see this." John gripped the steering wheel tighter as his mind raced. His name. Written for it. Sarah stared down at the book in her lap, tracing the worn leather cover with her fingertips. "It's more than a book," she murmured. "It's a ledger." John raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her continue. Sarah inhaled deeply, her hands trembling slightly. "I used to work at an antique shop," she began. "Nothing special, just a small place in town, the kind that sells old trinkets, rare books, and furniture people think is valuable. My boss, Mr. Lorne, was the quiet type, kept to himself, never talked much about his personal life. I'd been working there for a couple of years, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary." Her voice wavered slightly, and she paused as if trying to decide how much she should say. But then, as if a dam had broken, she continued. "One day, a man came in. He wasn't a regular, never seen him before. He went straight to the back, didn't even look at the shelves. Just walked up to Mr. Lorne, handed him an envelope, and left. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it at the time. But later that night, after we closed up, I stayed behind to finish some inventory. That's when I saw it." John glanced at her, his patience wearing thin. "Saw what?" Sarah swallowed hard. Lorne had left his office door open a crack. He never did that. He was always careful, always locking things up tight. But that night, I saw him sitting at his desk with this exact book in front of him. He was writing something down, checking what looked like old documents. And on the desk beside him, there were stacks of cash. Not just a few bills, piles of it. Way more than any antique shop could make. John felt a chill crawl up his spine. He'd seen shady dealings in his time, but nothing on that scale. "I should have minded my own business," Sarah admitted, shaking her head. "I should have just left. But curiosity got the best of me." After he left, I snuck into his office and opened the book. I don't know what I was expecting, but it sure as hell wasn't this. She lifted the book slightly, running her fingers over the gold-embossed lettering on the spine. Inside were names, hundreds of them. Some I recognized, most I didn't. There were dates, codes, numbers I couldn't understand. But one thing became clear fast. This wasn't just some old ledger. John tensed. Then what was it? Sarah met his gaze, her eyes dark with something close to fear. It was a record of bribes, blackmail, and payoffs. People in power, businessmen, politicians, law enforcement. Every shady deal, every dirty payment, written down in here like a confession waiting to be found. Lorne wasn't just selling antiques. He was a middleman, laundering money, arranging secret transactions, making sure nothing ever saw the light of day. This book, it's proof. Proof that could bring down people in this town that you wouldn't believe." John let out a low whistle. "And you just took it?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't plan to. I just wanted to see what was inside. But as I was flipping through it, I saw something I wasn't supposed to." She turned a few pages and pointed to a section near the middle. "Right here. This name." John leaned in and felt his stomach twist. There it was, his name. John Miller. Listed right alongside numbers and figures that meant nothing to him. But seeing it written there, in that book filled with corruption, sent a cold wave of dread through his body. He shook his head. "I don't know what this means. I've never been involved in any of this. I'm a damn farmer, for God's sake." Sarah bit her lip. "I know. That's what doesn't make sense. Your name is here, but I don't know why. And neither did I, until last night." John frowned. "What happened last night?" Sarah hesitated, then continued. "After I stole the book, I ran. I didn't know who I could trust. I had planned to leave town, maybe go to the police, but before I could do anything, someone broke into my apartment. They tore the place apart, looking for this." She patted the book. "That's when I knew this wasn't just about money, it was about control. Someone in power doesn't want this book getting out, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it hidden." John exhaled slowly, trying to piece everything together. "So you ran. You ended up on that road. And then I found you." Sarah nodded. "I didn't mean to drag you into this, I swear. I just needed help." John rubbed a hand down his face. This was bad, worse than he could have imagined. If what she was saying was true, then they were both in serious danger. He had no idea why his name was in that book, but if the people who wanted it back thought he was involved, then he was as much a target as she was. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began to fall in thick sheets, pelting the windshield as they drove deeper into the woods. John took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. "We need a plan," he said finally. "Somewhere safe to go. Someone we can trust." Sarah bit her lip. "I don't know who we can trust." John's jaw tightened. "Then we find out. But one thing's for sure, whoever's after you isn't just going to give up." As if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance behind them, piercing through the rain and darkness. Sarah's breath hitched. "They found us." John pressed his foot to the gas, the truck lurching forward. He had no idea how this night was going to end, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them take her. Or the book. Not without a fight. John's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The headlights behind them grew brighter, slicing through the thick veil of rain. Whoever was following them wasn't just watching anymore, they were making their move. Sarah's breath was uneven, shallow, her fingers trembling as she clutched the book to her chest. "What do we do?" she whispered, though her voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of the rain and the rumble of the truck's engine. John didn't hesitate. "We lose them." The dirt road was slick with mud, every turn a potential disaster, but John had driven these backroads his entire life. He knew how they twisted and curved, how they dipped unpredictably, where the terrain was solid and where it would turn to slush. The truck fishtailed as he took a sharp turn, but he corrected it expertly, sending a spray of mud and water into the air. The car behind them wasn't as lucky. It skidded slightly, struggling to stay on course, and John took the opportunity to push the truck faster, the old engine roaring in protest. The rain pounded harder now, turning the world into a distorted blur. Sarah turned in her seat, watching the car behind them with wide eyes. "They're not giving up." John gritted his teeth. Didn't expect them to. For a split second, he considered stopping, facing them head-on, demanding answers. But he knew better. These weren't men looking for a civil discussion. They weren't going to offer explanations or accept apologies. If they caught up, things would turn ugly fast. Up ahead, the road forked. One path led back toward town, a straight shot down the main road where anyone could see them. The other led deeper into the woods, a winding, treacherous route that few dared to take in weather like this. John didn't hesitate. He veered left, sending the truck onto the forest road, where the trees grew denser, their branches clawing at the windshield like desperate fingers. The tires struggled for traction, mud splattering against the undercarriage, but John kept the speed steady. The headlights behind them disappeared for a moment as the pursuers hesitated at the fork. Then, a second later, they appeared again. They had chosen to follow. Sarah cursed under her breath. "They're not stopping." John didn't respond. His mind was racing. They needed an advantage, something to tip the odds in their favor. Then he remembered. A mile ahead, hidden in the trees, was an old service road. It was barely more than a path, overgrown and forgotten, but John knew it well. If he could reach it before the car behind them closed in, they might have a chance. The truck jolted as it hit a deep pothole, and Sarah yelped, grabbing onto the dashboard. "This is insane," she muttered. John ignored her, eyes locked on the road ahead. The entrance to the service road was coming up fast. He needed to time this perfectly. "Hold on," he warned. At the last second, he jerked the wheel, sending the truck careening onto the hidden path. The branches scraped against the sides like nails on a chalkboard, but the truck fit, barely. The car behind them didn't. John glanced in the rearview mirror just in time to see their pursuers overshoot the turn, their tires unable to grip the slick mud. The vehicle swerved wildly before slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. Sarah gasped, turning in her seat to see. Did they? John didn't wait to find out. "They're not dead," he muttered. "But they're stuck. And that gives us a head start." He pushed the truck forward, maneuvering through the thick underbrush until they emerged on the other side of the woods, where the land opened up into a wide stretch of farmland. The storm was beginning to lighten, but the air still crackled with electricity. Sarah exhaled sharply, sinking into her seat. "I can't believe that worked." John's jaw was still clenched. "We bought time. Nothing more." She turned to him, her eyes searching. "Then what now?" John didn't answer right away. He had been so focused on escaping that he hadn't thought beyond it. But now that they had a moment of breathing room, the weight of everything came crashing down on him. His name in that book. The men chasing them. The implications of it all. "There's someone we can go to," he said finally. "An old friend. If anyone can help us figure this out, it's him." Sarah looked uncertain. "Can we trust him?" John hesitated. He hadn't seen this friend in years, not since things had gone sideways between them. But if there was one person who knew how to dig into secrets, it was him. "We don't have a choice," John said. Sarah nodded slowly. "Then let's go." The rain had slowed to a drizzle as they drove, but the storm wasn't the only thing lingering in the air. Something bigger was coming, something neither of them fully understood yet. And John had a feeling this was only the beginning. The road ahead stretched into darkness, broken only by the dull glow of the headlights and the distant rumble of thunder still echoing in the distance. John drove in silence, his fingers gripping the wheel, his mind racing through everything that had happened. The moment Sarah had pulled that book from her bag, everything had changed. His quiet, uneventful life had been thrown into chaos, and now he was driving through the night with a woman he barely knew, chased by men who clearly had no intention of letting them go. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her body tense, fingers still clutching the leather-bound book. She hadn't spoken in a while, her gaze fixed on the side mirror, as if expecting another set of headlights to appear at any moment. The near escape had bought them time, but not much. Whoever was after them wasn't going to give up that easily. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's this friend of yours?" John exhaled through his nose, staring at the wet road ahead. "His name's Daniel Carter. Used to be a sheriff." Sarah frowned. "Used to be?" John nodded. "He left the force a few years back. Went off the grid for a while. But if there's one person who knows how to dig up dirt on powerful people, it's him." She hesitated. "Do you trust him?" John didn't answer right away. That was the problem. He used to trust Daniel, back when they were younger, when Daniel still wore his badge with pride. But things had changed. John had never asked too many questions, but he'd heard the rumors. Daniel had gotten too close to something he shouldn't have, had rattled the wrong cages. When he resigned, he didn't just leave the force, he left town. "I trust him more than I trust anyone else right now," John said finally. Sarah nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Then again, John wasn't sure he was convinced either. They drove for another 20 minutes in silence, winding through back roads that only someone who had lived in these parts their whole life would know. The further they went, the less the world around them felt familiar. The trees thickened, the land becoming wild and untamed. Then, finally, they reached their destination. Daniel's place was tucked away in the woods, barely visible from the road. A small cabin with a tin roof, surrounded by an overgrown field and rusted-out cars that had long since stopped running. The porch light was off, but John knew better than to think the place was empty. Daniel never turned on the lights unless he had to. He pulled the truck up beside an old, beaten-up motorcycle and killed the engine. The moment the headlights blinked off, the night seemed to swallow them whole. Sarah glanced at him. "You sure about this?" "No," John admitted, "but we don't have a lot of options." They climbed out of the truck, boots crunching against the wet ground. John approached the front door and knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, this time harder. A few seconds later, there was a sound from inside. A shuffle of movement, the metallic click of a safety being turned off. Then the door swung open, and there stood Daniel Carter. The years had changed him. His face was harder, his beard thicker, his eyes more tired. He looked at John, then at Sarah, then at the truck behind them. Without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. John walked inside first, Sarah following close behind. The cabin was as John remembered, small, cluttered, filled with old books, maps, and stacks of papers that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The smell of whiskey and cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Daniel shut the door behind them, locking it with 3 separate bolts before turning to face them. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he said, his voice gruff. John sighed. "Good to see you too, Daniel." Daniel's eyes flicked to Sarah. "Who's she?" Sarah hesitated, but John answered for her. "Her name's Sarah. And we're in trouble." Daniel studied them both for a moment, then walked to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of whiskey and pouring himself a drink. "What kind of trouble?" John glanced at Sarah. She reached into her bag, pulling out the leather-bound book. "This kind," she said, setting it down on the table. Daniel eyed it, then exhaled sharply. "Well, shit." John crossed his arms. "You know what it is?" Daniel took a slow sip of whiskey. "I've heard rumors. A ledger filled with the names of every corrupt official, every dirty cop, every backroom deal in this state. Didn't think it actually existed." Sarah swallowed. "It does." Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair, then sat down at the table, flipping open the book. His eyes scanned the pages, moving quickly, taking in the information as if he already knew what he was looking for. Then, he stopped. His fingers tapped the edge of the page. You know your name's in here, right? John exhaled sharply. Yeah. That was a fun surprise. Daniel frowned. You have any idea why? John shook his head. None. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. Well, I do. John stiffened. What do you mean? Daniel sighed. You remember my last case? The one that got me kicked off the force? John nodded. Vaguely. Daniel tapped the book again. I was investigating a land deal. Some powerful people were buying up farmland under dummy corporations, flipping it for 10 times what it was worth. It was all tied to bribery, money laundering, the whole damn playbook. But I could never prove it. He looked up at John. Your name's in here because they were planning to take your land too. John felt the ground shift beneath him. What? Daniel nodded. They had it all lined up. Fake paperwork, forged signatures. If this deal had gone through, you wouldn't even own your farm anymore. John clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life working that land. It was all he had. And these bastards had been planning to steal it right out from under him? Sarah's voice was quiet. That means they don't just want the book back. They want to erase everything connected to it. Daniel nodded. Exactly. And that means they won't stop until we're all either dead or buried so deep no one will ever find us. Silence filled the room. The weight of the situation pressed down on them like a heavy fog. Finally, John exhaled. So what do we do? Daniel set his glass down. We fight back. Sarah looked skeptical. How? These people have power, resources. We're just what? Daniel interrupted. A farmer, an ex-cop, and a woman who stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to? He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. That's exactly why we have a shot. They won't see it coming. John studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. What's the plan? Daniel smirked. First, we let them think they've won. Then, we take everything from them. Sarah still looked uncertain, but there was something in Daniel's voice, something steady, unshakable. For the first time that night, John felt something other than fear. Hope. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the storm further into the night. But inside that cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. One that was about to change everything. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. John had always been a man who lived by simple principles: work hard, mind your own business, and help where you can. But this? This wasn't just helping someone. This was stepping into a war he never even knew existed. And yet, deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. His land, his name, and possibly his life were on the line. If they didn't act, these people would erase them as easily as crossing out a name in that damned book. Sarah sat across the table, still clutching the ledger like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The years had hardened him, but there was something else in his expression now, something John hadn't seen in a long time. Fire. A purpose. John exhaled. All right, you said we fight back. How? Daniel grinned, the kind of grin that told John he'd been waiting for this moment. First, we need to make them think we're running. They expect us to hide, to go underground, to disappear. That's what people do when they're being hunted. Sarah frowned. But we're not. Daniel shook his head. No. We're going to make them come to us. But on our terms. John studied him carefully. And how exactly do we do that? Daniel leaned forward, tapping the book with his finger. This book? It's leverage. Right now, They think we're just trying to survive. They think we don't have a plan. But if we make them believe that we're about to release everything in here, that's when they get desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You want to bait them? Daniel nodded. Exactly. John crossed his arms. And what happens when they come? Daniel's smirk returned. Then we take them down. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Sarah glanced at John, her expression wary. This is insane. John exhaled through his nose. It is. He turned back to Daniel. But I don't see another choice. Daniel nodded. Good. Because we don't have time to second-guess this. He reached into a drawer, pulled out an old burner phone, and slid it across the table. Sarah, you're going to make a call. She tensed. To who? Daniel smirked. To the people who want you dead. Her face paled. That's suicide. Daniel shook his head. Not if we control the conversation. You tell them you're scared, that you made a mistake, that you just want to make a deal. They'll believe it because that's what they expect. They think you're just a scared girl who got in over her head. Sarah hesitated, then picked up the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. What do I say? Daniel leaned back. You tell them you have the book. That you want to return it. But on your terms. A public place. Somewhere they can't just kill you outright. John frowned. And what do we do while they're preparing for the meet? Daniel's grin widened. We prepare for them. The next 24 hours were a blur of movement, planning, and old instincts kicking in. John never thought he'd be the kind of man to set traps for hired killers, but here he was, digging shallow pits on Daniel's property, setting up hidden cameras, and going over backup plans in case things went south. Sarah had made the call. The man on the other end had been calm, eerily calm. He hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened. Just simply said, you did the right thing. We'll be in touch with the location. That was what scared John the most. The confidence. The certainty that they were in control. But they weren't. Daniel had picked the meetup spot, a truck stop just outside of town. Public, but not too public. Enough space to move, but not so crowded that innocent people would get caught in the crossfire. John adjusted his hat, watching from the cab of Daniel's old truck as Sarah sat alone at the picnic table outside the truck stop. The book was in her lap. Well, a book was. They weren't about to bring the real ledger out in the open. Instead, Daniel had found an old, similar-looking book, filled with nonsense. The trap was set. See anything? John asked, his fingers tapping against his thigh. Daniel, watching through a pair of binoculars, exhaled through his nose. Black sedan, 10 o'clock. 2 guys inside. They're watching, but they're not moving yet. John nodded. Waiting for confirmation. Daniel grunted. Probably. John's pulse thrummed. If they had called in more reinforcements, this was about to get ugly. Then, the sedan's doors opened. 2 men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits, both moving with the kind of precision that told John they weren't amateurs. Sarah stiffened slightly but didn't bolt. She kept her hands in her lap, kept her breathing steady. Just like they'd rehearsed. One of the men approached her, slow, measured. Miss Harper, he said, voice as smooth as glass. I'm glad you came to your senses. Sarah swallowed. I just want this to be over. The man smiled. I'm sure you do. His eyes flicked to the book in her lap. May I? Sarah hesitated. Just enough to sell it. Then, slowly, she slid it across the table. The man picked it up, flipping through the pages. His smile faltered. John knew that look. He knew exactly the second the man realized he'd been played. And that's when Daniel pulled the trigger. The sniper round shattered the passenger side window of the sedan, sending glass raining down. The driver panicked, reaching for something, probably a gun, but Daniel's second shot took out the tire, sending the car lurching sideways. The man at the table grabbed for Sarah, but John was already out of the truck. He moved fast, faster than he had in years, closing the distance between them in seconds. The man barely had time to react before John drove his fist into his gut, sending him sprawling. Sarah scrambled backward, grabbing the stun gun Daniel had given her. The second guy from the car came charging toward her, but she jammed the stun gun into his side, sending him crumpling to the ground with a strangled cry. John turned to the first man, who was gasping for air. He grabbed him by the collar, yanking him up. "Who sent you?" he growled. The man sneered. "You're dead. You don't even know it yet." John slammed him back against the table. "Who sent you?" The man coughed, blood trickling from his lip. "You think this ends with us? You think we're the only ones?" He grinned, teeth red. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." John narrowed his eyes. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" The man chuckled. "Because you'll be dead before you can do anything about it." Before John could react, the man reached into his jacket, not for a gun, but for something else. A small device. A trigger. John's stomach dropped. Daniel's voice rang out. "Get back." John barely had time to move before the device beeped once, just once, and the sedan exploded. The force sent him flying backward, the heat searing against his skin. The blast was deafening, shaking the ground beneath them. John hit the pavement hard, pain radiating through his back. Through the smoke, he saw Sarah coughing, struggling to get up. Daniel was already moving, dragging them both away. John's head was spinning, ears ringing, but he knew one thing. They had just started a war. The world around John was a blur of heat and sound, the force of the explosion still ringing in his ears. Smoke billowed into the night sky, a dark, churning mass illuminated by the flames consuming the remains of the black sedan. The fire cracked and roared, casting flickering shadows across the pavement, but John had no time to watch. His body ached from the impact, but adrenaline was a powerful drug. It pushed aside the pain, sharpened his focus. Sarah was coughing beside him, struggling to catch her breath. Daniel was already on his feet, scanning the area for any signs of movement. They weren't safe yet. Whoever had sent these men wouldn't be satisfied with a single failed operation. No, this was just the beginning. John forced himself upright, eyes narrowing as he looked at the unconscious man lying near the truck stop table. The explosion had knocked him out cold, but he was still breathing. The other one, the one who had triggered the bomb, hadn't been so lucky. His body lay twisted, partially covered in flaming debris. John barely spared him a glance. He'd made his choice. Daniel moved quickly, grabbing the unconscious man by the collar and yanking him to his feet. He groaned, head lolling to the side, but Daniel wasn't gentle. He shook him hard, his voice a low growl. "Who do you work for?" The man barely managed to open his swollen eyes, his lip curled in a bloody smirk. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. "You think you've won?" Daniel didn't have time for bravado. He hauled the man toward the truck and shoved him inside, slamming the door shut. "We need to move. Now." John nodded, his mind still racing. "Where to?" Daniel exhaled, glancing back at the fire. "Somewhere they won't expect us." They didn't waste time. Sarah climbed into the truck beside John, her hands still shaking as she clutched the fake ledger. Daniel jumped into the back seat, keeping an eye on their unconscious passenger. As John sped away from the burning wreckage, Sarah turned to him, voice tight. They're not going to stop coming, are they? John's grip on the wheel tightened. No. They won't. Daniel leaned forward, his voice grim. Then we make the next move before they do. John had spent his life avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, working his land. He had never once imagined himself in the middle of something like this. But now, the fight had come to his doorstep, and if there was one thing he knew, it was that men like the ones after them only understood one thing: power. And if they wanted a fight, they were damn sure going to get one. The rain had started up again, a light drizzle that misted against the windshield. The old road stretched out before them, twisting into the darkness. They needed a plan. They needed leverage. And John knew exactly where to get it. Head to the old train yard, he said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You got a stash of weapons I don't know about? John shook his head. Not weapons. Answers. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? John exhaled. There's someone I know. Someone who's worked with the people behind this. He might not know everything, but he knows enough. If we can get to him before they do, we might have a shot at turning this around. Daniel nodded slowly, considering. All right. But if he so much as twitches the wrong way, I'm putting a bullet in his leg. John didn't argue. The stakes were too high. They drove in tense silence, the rain turning into a steady drizzle as they neared the abandoned train yard. The place had been shut down years ago, left to rust and decay, but some people still used it, for meetings, for deals, for things that weren't meant to be seen. John parked the truck behind an old freight car, keeping the headlights off. He turned to Daniel. Stay here with him, he said, nodding toward their unconscious passenger. If he wakes up, make sure he doesn't do anything stupid. Daniel smirked. Oh, I'll make sure. Sarah and John stepped out into the rain, moving quickly across the gravel. The wind howled through the gaps in the rusted metal, making the whole place feel like a graveyard. Then John saw him. A man in a long coat, standing near the tracks, smoking a cigarette. He looked up as they approached, eyes narrowing. John Miller, he said, exhaling smoke. Didn't think I'd see you again. John stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands loose at his sides. Didn't think I'd be back. The man, Nathan Briggs, smirked. So, what brings you to my little corner of the world? John didn't waste time. The ledger. Briggs stiffened. Careful what you say, John. John stepped closer. No more careful. No more running. I need to know who's pulling the strings. Briggs took another drag of his cigarette, studying him. You really don't know, do you? John clenched his jaw. If I did, I wouldn't be here. Briggs exhaled slowly, then glanced at Sarah. And you're the girl who stole it, huh? Sarah didn't flinch. Yeah. That's me. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. Damn. You've both stepped in some serious shit. John's patience was wearing thin. Who is it? Briggs sighed, flicking his cigarette to the ground. You ever hear the name Victor Langley? John frowned. No. Briggs nodded. Of course you haven't. That's the point. He's the man behind the curtain, the one who keeps everything running smooth while making sure people like you don't even know he exists. He owns politicians, judges, cops, you name it. And if he wants you gone, you don't just disappear. You cease to exist. Sarah's breath hitched. So that's who's after us? Briggs nodded. And he won't stop. Not until that book is destroyed and everyone connected to it is dead. John's mind raced. Then we hit him first. Briggs laughed. You don't just hit a guy like Langley. You don't even get close. John smirked. We'll see about that. Briggs shook his head. You're a dead man, Miller. You know that, right? John's smile faded. Maybe. But I'm taking him down with me. Briggs exhaled, studying him for a long moment. Then, to John's surprise, he nodded. All right. You want a shot at Langley? I'll give you a name. He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. There's a guy in Langley's inner circle. Someone who knows all the secrets. You find him, you find the cracks in Langley's armor. John's heart pounded. Who? Briggs hesitated, then finally said it. His name is Malcolm Tate. John exchanged a glance with Sarah. This was it, their way in. And it was only just beginning.